A Sicilian fisherman waves at incoming Genoese ships, but no one waves back. He boards to find blackened corpses everywhere, the plague that will kill 75 million Europeans. How did a single ship destroy half of medieval civilization? Picture a quiet autumn morning in the Sicilian port of Messina. The sun shines softly over the harbor as fishermen bring in their catch. One fisherman looks up and sees sails far away on the water. Genoese ships are coming in. He wipes his hands clean, raises his arm and waves hello, but nobody waves back. Curious, he walks closer, gets on one of the ships and climbs the creaky wooden steps, calling out to anyone who might be there. Then a terrible smell hits him, thick, awful, and wrong. Bodies lie scattered everywhere like broken toys. Some people are already dead, others can barely move. Their skin is covered with black spots and their arms and legs are swollen in scary ways. He stumbles backward, horrified by what he sees. These ships have brought more than trade goods, they carry death itself. In the months ahead, whole towns will disappear. Between 75 and 200 million people will die. This is the Black Death, the terrible sickness that killed half the people in Europe during medieval times. Before we follow death's dark path across the land, we need to understand the amazing world it was about to destroy. The Europe of 1340 was at the top of medieval success. It was a place full of confidence, wealth, and more people than ever before. This wasn't the simple, backwards time that many people imagine today. Instead, it was a smart society that had created some of the greatest things humans had ever built. The number of people in Europe had almost tripled since the year 1000, reaching about 75 million souls. Great cities grew along trade paths. Paris had maybe 200,000 people living there, making it bigger than any place Europe had seen since Rome fell apart. The tall Gothic churches reaching toward the sky showed not just love of God, but the best building skills anywhere. These buildings were so beautiful that some people back then thought only God himself could have helped build them. Medieval Europeans believed they understood how the world worked. The greatest thinkers of the time had figured out what seemed like everything about the universe. God's creation followed clear rules that human minds could understand. Thomas Aquinas had recently put together old Greek ideas with Christian teaching, creating a way of thinking that seemed to explain everything from how stars moved to why humans existed. Universities in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna brought together Europe's smartest people who felt sure they knew divine truth. But underneath all this success lay serious problems. The Great Famine from 1315 to 1317 had already shown how weak Europe really was. Climate change and crop failures killed maybe 10% of all people. Even worse, Europe's very success had created the perfect conditions for its own destruction. Crowded cities, busy trade routes, and people living close together with animals in packed towns. This was a civilization that had convinced itself it had answers to life's biggest questions. This dangerous confidence would soon face its greatest test. While Europe enjoyed its golden age far away in the wide steppes of Central Asia, death was waking up. Among the windy mountains of what we now call Kyrgyzstan, something terrible was stirring. Recent digging by scientists has traced the beginnings of the Black Death to the Tian Shan Mountains. Their ancient plague germs showed us where humanity's worst pandemic began. Here in the early decades of the 14th century, Yersinia pestis changed into a form much more deadly to humans. It transformed from a sickness that mostly affected wild rodents into a world-conquering plague. The germ Yersinia pestis had been humanity's hidden companion for thousands of years, hiding in colonies of marmots, ground squirrels, and other rodents that dotted the lands across Asia and Europe. But something changed in those mountain valleys around 1338. Changes in weather, humans moving into new areas, or perhaps just the endless math of genetic changes created perfect conditions for this tiny killer to jump from animal hosts into the bloodstream of human history. The plague's journey westward followed the same routes that had made civilizations rich for centuries. We now call these paths the Silk Road. Think of these ancient pathways as the medieval version of today's internet, a huge network connecting far corners of the known world. Just like our modern digital highways carry both helpful information and computer viruses across continents in seconds. These trade routes served as arteries of both wealth and disease. The very networks that had brought luxury goods, new ideas, and cultural exchange to countless cities would now become the pathways of their destruction. Think about the deep irony here. The same connections that had allowed medieval civilization to grow strong would now help it almost completely collapse. The plague started in China in the early to mid-1300s and spread along trade routes westward, following the ancient paths carved by human ambition and business. It was carried by merchants who had no idea they were carrying humanity's doom alongside their valuable cargo. Mongol warriors and merchants moving between their scattered lands carried more than their usual goods of horses, furs, and silver. The disease was taken to Crimea by Mongol warriors and traders, where it would make its deadly leap into European awareness. The great trading city of Kaffa, which we now call Feodosia in Crimea, became ground zero for Europe's meeting with the plague. Here unfolds one of history's most grimly fascinating stories. In 1346, during a siege of Kaffa by Mongol forces, the plague struck the attacking army with devastating force. The Mongol commander, seeing his forces collapse, ordered the bodies of plague victims to be catapulted over the city walls. This was perhaps the first recorded use of biological warfare. As one writer of the time noted with horror, what seemed like mountains of dead were thrown into the city, and the Christians could not hide or flee or escape from them. The Genoese merchants in Kaffa, seeing the city's rapid fall into chaos, made the decision that would seal Europe's fate. They loaded their ships with whatever goods they could grab and fled westward across the Black Sea, carrying with them the invisible passengers that would transform the medieval world. Those black rats in the ship's storage areas with their fleas full of Yersinia pestis were about to become the unwitting agents of Europe's darkest hour. When those 12 Genoese galleys limped into the harbor of Messina in October 1347, the harbor master and townspeople who gathered to greet them saw a scene from nightmares. Most of the sailors were already dead, their bodies lying across the decks. Those still alive were barely recognizable as human beings. Their skin was blackened, their lymph nodes grotesquely swollen, blood and pus oozing from their openings. The Sicilian authorities, recognizing the danger but not understanding its true nature, ordered the ships to leave immediately. But it was already too late. The plague had found its foothold in Europe, and like water seeping through cracks in a dam, it would spread unstoppably through every crack of medieval society. Picture Maria, a young mother living near Messina's harbor. She watched those terrible ships arrive, saw the authorities turn them away, and probably felt relieved that the danger had passed. Within a week, her husband was dead. Within 2 weeks, her children. By month's end, Maria herself lay in one of the mass graves hastily dug outside the city walls. Her story, multiplied by millions, represents the human reality behind the numbers. From Sicily, the plague spread with mathematical precision, following the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world. By early 1348, it had reached the busy ports of Genoa and Venice, the business hearts of medieval Europe. From there, it advanced along the ancient Roman roads, up river valleys, and across mountain passes, transforming every pathway of human connection into a corridor of death. To understand the scale of what followed, we must abandon our modern idea of gradual change and imagine instead a world where catastrophe moved with the speed of rumors and the certainty of tides. At least 1/3 of the European population, more than 25 million people, died between 1347 and 1352, though recent research suggests the toll may have been even higher. In some areas, death rates approached 60%. Paris, the greatest city north of the Alps, became a house of death. Writers of the time describe streets littered with corpses, churches overflowing with the dead, and the constant sound of church bells ringing for the departed until there were too few survivors to ring them. One Parisian priest wrote to his brother, "The city has become a tomb. We who remain walk among the dead and know not if we shall join them by evening." The city's population may have fallen from 200,000 to fewer than 100,000 souls. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed the collapse of everything he had known as civilized life. His account in the Decameron provides one of our most vivid glimpses into the plague's social destruction. How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, breakfast with their kinfolk, and the same night supped with their ancestors in the next world. Boccaccio recorded how traditional burial rites collapsed entirely, with bodies buried in mass graves like merchandise stowed in the hold of a ship. Imagine being that 13-year-old girl in Florence that Boccaccio might have known. Your family is gone. The streets are filled with corpses. The church bells that once marked the rhythm of daily life now ring constantly until there's no one left to ring them. You wander through neighborhoods where entire households have vanished, where doors hang open and gardens grow wild because there's no one left to tend them. This was the reality for thousands of children who survived the initial wave, orphaned in a world that had forgotten how to care for the living. London suffered what medieval chroniclers called the Great Mortality, transforming the bustling commercial capital into a ghost town. The Thames, normally crowded with merchant vessels, carried instead the bodies of plague victims downstream to the sea. Emergency burial grounds were established at East Smithfield, where archaeologists have uncovered mass graves containing thousands of plague victims, many showing signs of hasty burial and the characteristic lesions of bubonic plague. Perhaps most haunting are the accounts from smaller settlements, the villages and market towns that formed the backbone of medieval life. Here, the plague's impact was often total. Entire communities simply vanished, their fields returning to wilderness, their churches standing empty, their names surviving only in tax records and land grants. The village of Tusmore in Oxfordshire was completely abandoned, its population either dead or fled. The psychological impact proved almost as devastating as the physical toll. Traditional human bonds dissolved in the face of overwhelming mortality. Parents abandoned plague-stricken children. Spouses fled from infected partners. Priests refused to administer last rites. The Italian chronicler Matteo Villani observed that neither relatives nor friends could be found to take care of the sick or bury the dead. This wasn't mere cowardice. It was the complete breakdown of the social contract in the face of existential terror. Strange phenomena accompanied the plague's passage. Witnesses reported seeing mysterious figures in white robes walking through cities at night, marking doors with crosses to indicate future victims. A French chronicle records, many swore they saw Death himself walking the streets of Avignon, a tall figure in a dark cloak pointing at houses where the pestilence would strike. Foul odors preceded the plague's arrival in many towns, smells so distinctive that survivors could predict an outbreak days before the first deaths occurred. Medieval physicians trained in the classical traditions that had guided healing for centuries found themselves utterly helpless before the plague's onslaught. Their carefully constructed understanding of disease crumbled when confronted with Yersinia pestis. Think of it like modern doctors suddenly facing an alien pathogen that ignored everything they knew about medicine. Their expertise became not just useless, but dangerous as it gave false confidence. The plague manifested in 3 distinct forms, each more terrifying than the last. Bubonic plague, the most common form, announced itself through the appearance of buboes, swollen lymph nodes that could grow to the size of oranges, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. Contemporary chroniclers described the buboes as God's tokens, divine marks that foretold inevitable death. A physician in Montpellier wrote, "The swellings appear suddenly, hard as stones, burning with fever. When they burst, the stench fills the room and death follows within days." Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs directly, causing victims to cough up blood and die within hours of showing symptoms. This form spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets. No fleas or rats required. Entire households could be wiped out in a single day when pneumonic plague took hold. Most feared of all was septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. Victims of this form often died so quickly, sometimes within hours, that they showed few external symptoms beyond the characteristic blackening of extremities that gave the plague its popular name. This darkening of the skin created the terrifying spectacle of people who appeared to be rotting while still alive. Medieval physicians tried everything in their considerable arsenal. They prescribed complex mixtures of herbs, performed bloodletting to balance the body's humors, and burned aromatic substances to purify corrupted air. Some recommended drinking one's own urine. Others suggested the application of crushed emeralds or powdered unicorn horn. Remedies that seem absurd to us but represented the cutting edge of medieval medical knowledge. Theriac, a legendary cure-all containing dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh, was prescribed at enormous expense. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of experimental cancer drugs. Desperately expensive treatments that desperate people will try when conventional medicine fails. None of it worked. The failure of established medicine created a crisis that extended far beyond medical practice. If the learned physicians with their Latin texts and university training could not explain or cure the plague, what other certainties of medieval life might prove equally hollow? In a world where natural disasters were universally understood as expressions of divine will, the plague's unprecedented scale demanded equally unprecedented explanations. Medieval Christians struggled to comprehend what sin could have been so great as to warrant such punishment. Many concluded that humanity itself had grown so corrupt that God had decided to start anew. Much as he had with Noah's flood, flagellant movements swept across Europe, with bands of penitents traveling from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public squares while calling for universal repentance. A German chronicler described these processions. They came singing hymns of death and redemption, their backs raw with self-inflicted wounds, calling upon all to repent before God's final judgment. These well-intentioned gatherings intended to appease divine wrath often became super-spreader events that carried the plague to previously unaffected communities. The search for scapegoats intensified as the death toll mounted. European Jews, already marginalized, found themselves blamed for the plague through grotesque conspiracy theories. Despite the obvious fact that Jews died from the plague at the same rates as Christians, rumors spread that they had poisoned wells or made pacts with devils to destroy Christendom. Entire Jewish communities were burned alive in Germany and France, their property seized by local authorities. This persecution revealed something disturbing about human nature under extreme stress, the tendency to prefer comprehensible evil to incomprehensible catastrophe. A Jewish conspiracy, however implausible, offered the illusion of human agency and control. It suggested that the plague had identifiable causes and could therefore be stopped through identifiable actions, even if those actions were themselves monstrous. Consider the testimony of a Jewish merchant from Strasbourg recorded before his community was destroyed. "We die as you die. We weep as you weep, yet you call us the authors of this misery. What madness has seized the world that suffering seeks to multiply itself through hatred?" As mortality rates soared beyond anything in recorded history, the fundamental institutions of medieval society began to collapse under their own weight. The feudal system, based on personal relationships between lord and vassal, simply couldn't function when death claimed both parties with equal indifference. Entire noble lineages vanished overnight, leaving vast estates without clear inheritance. The church, medieval Europe's most stable institution, found itself simultaneously overwhelmed with demand for its services and decimated by loss of personnel. Priests and monks who ministered to the dying and performed last rites died at even higher rates than the general population. Entire monasteries were abandoned, their accumulated centuries of learning left to decay. Economic life ground nearly to a halt. Markets that had operated continuously since Roman times simply ceased to function. The complex web of credit, trade relationships, and manufacturing that had supported medieval prosperity unraveled as quickly as plague spread through a household. Italian banking houses that had financed kingdoms collapsed when their agents across Europe died faster than new ones could be trained. In many regions, the basic human duty to bury the dead became impossible to fulfill. Mass graves were dug on the outskirts of every major city, and when these overflowed, bodies were simply burned in great pyres or left to rot where they fell. The sight of unburied dead, perhaps more than any other single factor, convinced survivors that the end times had truly arrived. Most tellingly, even fundamental social bonds, the ties between parent and child, husband and wife, dissolved under the pressure of absolute terror. Boccaccio recorded the unthinkable. Brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, brother by sister, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited to their fate, as if they had been strangers. When the plague finally began to recede in the early 1350s, not through any human intervention, but simply because it had killed so many potential hosts, the Europe that emerged was fundamentally transformed. The demographic catastrophe had shattered the old order so completely that restoration was impossible. Adaptation became the only option for survival. Labor, suddenly scarce after centuries of abundance, commanded unprecedented value. Surviving peasants found themselves in a position unthinkable before the plague. They could negotiate with their lords. A surviving English peasant's petition captures this transformation. My lord, the fields lie fallow, not for want of seed, but for want of hands. If you would have grain, you must offer more than custom demands. The Statute of Laborers, passed by the English Parliament in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But economic reality proved stronger than legislative decree. The Church, having lost much of its personnel and faced profound questions about divine justice, underwent significant reform movements. People who had watched learned theologians die as helplessly as illiterate peasants began to seek direct spiritual experience rather than institutional mediation. Intellectually, the plague marked the beginning of the end for medieval confidence in absolute truth. If learned authorities could not explain or prevent such catastrophe, perhaps human knowledge required new foundations entirely. Art and literature became increasingly preoccupied with mortality. The dance of death became a popular artistic motif, depicting skeletons leading representatives of every social class, popes and peasants, kings and merchants, in an eternal dance toward the grave. The plague also fundamentally altered European attitudes toward medicine, leading to increased emphasis on empirical observation over ancient texts. The Black Death shattered the belief that humans were somehow above nature's fury, revealing instead our place as biological creatures subject to the same forces that govern all life on Earth. Yet the story is not ultimately one of defeat, but of human resilience and adaptability. The Europe that emerged was smaller in population, but perhaps more dynamic, more questioning, more aware of both human limitations and possibilities. A survivor's letter from post-plague Paris captures this dual legacy. We who remain are fewer, but perhaps wiser. We have seen the worst that fate can bring, and yet we still plant seeds for next year's harvest. If this is not hope, what is? Today, as we face our own global challenges, the Black Death offers both warning and inspiration. It reminds us that human civilization, for all its achievements, remains fragile, but it also demonstrates that societies can survive even the most catastrophic challenges, emerging transformed but not destroyed. The Black Death was indeed humanity's greatest reckoning with mortality, but it was also, in its aftermath, a revelation of humanity's greatest strength, the ability to continue to adapt and to build anew even after confronting the abyss.